Every 34 minutes, a murder is committed in the United States, but most of them are never caught on camera. This one was. In 2002, a young woman walked into a grocery store in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Security cameras tracked her every move. Down aisle 3, past the checkout, out through the sliding glass doors. And then she was gone. What those cameras captured in the final 10 minutes before her disappearance would eventually crack open one of the most chilling serial killer cases in Louisiana history and expose a predator who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Stay with me, because the details of how investigators pieced together those 10 minutes will change the way you think about ordinary moments forever. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Early 2000s. A city of warmth, culture, and community, where neighbors knew each other by name and kids still played outside after dark. But beneath that southern charm, something was very, very wrong. Between 2001 and 2003, at least 5 women were murdered in the Baton Rouge area. Different ages, different backgrounds, different neighborhoods. But investigators began to notice something they couldn't ignore. The same DNA, the same killer. A task force was assembled. The FBI was called in, and an entire city began to lock its doors at night, not knowing that the man responsible might be someone they passed every single day. This is the story of the Baton Rouge serial killer, and the surveillance footage that ultimately helped bring him down. To understand how those 10 minutes mattered, you have to understand the women at the center of this story. Pam Kinamore was 44 years old, an interior designer, a wife, a woman described by everyone who knew her as generous, creative, and full of life. She ran her own business, loved her family fiercely, and had absolutely no reason to believe that a routine errand on the night of July 12, 2002, would be her last. That evening, Pam left her home in the Broadmoor neighborhood of Baton Rouge. She stopped at an Albertsons grocery store, a place she'd been dozens of times before. Familiar aisles, familiar cashiers, a completely ordinary stop, but ordinary was about to shatter. Now it's important to understand the atmosphere in Baton Rouge at that time. The city was already on edge. Just months earlier, in September 2001, a woman named Gina Wilson Green had been found strangled in her home. Then in May 2002, Charlotte Murray Pace, a 22-year-old graduate student, was murdered in her own apartment. The violence was escalating. Women were warned to be cautious. Police were under enormous pressure. And yet, the killer remained invisible. He left no witnesses, no meaningful leads, just DNA evidence that confirmed what investigators feared most. This was a single predator, methodical and calculating, who knew how not to be seen, until the cameras caught him. That Albertsons had a security system, standard for the time. Grainy footage, black and white, timestamps running across the bottom in blocky digital numbers. What it recorded that night would become the linchpin of the entire investigation. July 12, 2002. Late evening, Pam Kinamore was captured on the store's security camera entering the building at approximately 11:45 p.m. She moved through the store calmly. No signs of distress, no indication anything was wrong. She paid for her items. She walked toward the exit, and then she stepped outside. She never came home. Her husband reported her missing that same night. By morning, a search had begun. 3 days later, on July the 16th, Pam's body was discovered beneath the Whiskey Bay Bridge off Interstate 10, roughly halfway between Baton Rouge and Lafayette. She had been killed. The circumstances were consistent with the previous victims. The same DNA was found at the scene. But here's where those 10 minutes become everything. When investigators reviewed the Albertsons security footage, they noticed something in the parking lot. A white pickup truck, circling, waiting. Positioned in a way that suggested the driver knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly who he was watching. Think about that for a moment. While Pam was inside doing something as ordinary as grocery shopping, someone was outside in the dark waiting for her. The footage was grainy. The plate wasn't fully legible, but the vehicle itself, a white truck, became a critical piece of evidence. Investigators began canvassing. They asked gas stations, businesses, and residents along the I-10 corridor, "Did you see a white truck?" And slowly, painfully slowly, answers started coming in. The Baton Rouge serial killer task force was one of the largest in Louisiana history. At its peak, investigators were processing over 1,000 tips a week. They pursued every lead. They interviewed sex offenders, conducted neighborhood sweeps, and worked in collaboration with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Their profile of the suspect? White male, mid-30s to 40s, likely employed, organized, someone with enough social camouflage to move through communities undetected. But here's where this case takes a turn that no one saw coming. The DNA collected from the crime scenes was eventually run through CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. No match. The suspect had no prior record. He was invisible to the system. So investigators did something they had never done at that scale before in Louisiana. They requested voluntary DNA samples from men in the area who matched the profile. Hundreds of men stepped forward. Hundreds of samples were collected and tested. None of them matched. Weeks passed, then months. Then came the break. In 2003, investigators received information pointing them toward a man named Derek Todd Lee, a 34-year-old from St. Francisville, Louisiana, who had a prior history of violent incidents and stalking behavior. He was not a stranger to law enforcement on a local level, but somehow, despite previous encounters with the system, his DNA had never been entered into the federal database. A DNA sample was collected from Lee. It matched every single crime scene. Derek Todd Lee was arrested in May 2003 in Atlanta, Georgia, where he had fled. Investigators believe he was responsible for the murders of at least 6 women, and possibly more. Victims included Gina Wilson Green, Charlotte Murray Pace, Pam Kinamore, Trinisha Dean Cullum, Carrie Lynn Yoder, and Danae Cullum. He had lived among the community for years, worked, smiled, gone undetected. And that white truck in the parking lot? Investigators confirmed that Lee drove a vehicle matching that description. It couldn't secure a conviction on its own, but it placed him in a pattern of predatory behavior that prosecutors would argue was deliberate and calculated. Derek Todd Lee was tried and convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in Louisiana courts. He was sentenced to death. In a separate trial, he received an additional life sentence. In 2016, Lee died on death row of heart failure before his execution could be carried out. Justice, in the legal sense, was served, but for the families of his victims, for the husbands, children, parents, and friends left behind. No verdict erases what was taken. Pam Kinamore's family lost a wife, a mother, a creative force who filled every room she entered with warmth. Her memory and the memories of all the victims deserve to be carried forward with dignity. And then there's the question that still lingers in the minds of investigators and true crime researchers alike. Were there more victims? Lee's geographic movement, his timeline, and certain unsolved cases in the region have led some researchers to believe the confirmed victim count may not be the final number. Those investigations remain open. Here's what we know for certain. 10 minutes of surveillance footage in a grocery store parking lot became one of the most critical pieces of the investigative puzzle. Not because it solved the case on its own, but because it proved something important. Predators rely on invisibility, and sometimes the ordinary moments, the ones nobody thinks to look at twice, are exactly where the truth is hiding. The next time you walk out of a store at night, you probably won't think about the camera above the door. But somewhere in some investigation room, an analyst might be doing exactly that, watching the last 10 minutes of an ordinary evening, searching for the moment everything changed. That's the quiet, unsettling truth about these cases. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think investigators should have identified Derek Todd Lee sooner? And what could the system have done differently? Let me know in the comments below. If this video made you think, please give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about justice and truth. Subscribe if you're new here, and make sure the bell is on so you never miss an upload. And if you want to go deeper, next week we're covering a case where the surveillance footage didn't just identify a suspect. It became the entire trial. You won't want to miss it.